I'd been greasing axles and shoeing teams on the Coldwater line for better than 30 years the morning. A six-horse string of fresh-broke bays took the bit in the main street and went. And I want to tell you about it because it was the first time I ever saw a thing I couldn't explain. Three men were already hanging off the lead lines and being dragged for it, boot heels plowing furrows in the mud, and the wagon behind those horses was loaded with mined timber and coming on like the end of the world. People were running for the boardwalk. A man named Cleve Ott, who was the best driver Gideon Rourke had, was flat on his back where the box had thrown him. And then this woman walked off the stage that had just rolled in, set down a carpetbag in the road like she had all the day in the world, and walked straight at the runaway. I hollered at her. Everybody hollered at her. She didn't seem to hear any of us. She didn't go for the lines the way the men had, hauling and sawing and getting dragged. She went in at an angle, quartering, talking the whole way, not loud, low, a sound I felt more than heard, and she got a hand on the near-wheeler's cheek strap, and then she just walked with them. Walked, mind you, fast, leaning her whole small weight back into that horse's head, turning him a hair, then a hair more, easing the whole string out of its panic and into a wide curve that brought them up against the freight platform soft as you please, blowing and trembling and done. She stood there a second with her hand on that horse's neck, saying something to him I'll never know, and the timber wagon ticked to a stop a foot off the rail. The street was dead quiet. She picked the mud off her glove like it was the only thing that troubled her. I was the first one to get my legs working. I went out to her and I said, "Ma'am, that was about the finest piece of handling I ever saw in my life, and who in the world are you?" And she looked at me with eyes the gray of weathered cedar and she said, "I'm Della Hartwell. I've come to marry Gideon Rourke." Now I'd worked for Gideon 11 years and known him for 20, and I knew he had posted east for a wife the way you'd post for a stove or a good dog, because the man had stopped living the day his brother died, and a posted bride was the most living thing he could make himself do. I knew the letters had gone back and forth all summer. And I knew, the second she said his name, that Gideon Rourke had no earthly idea what was coming to him, because the woman he'd ordered to keep his house had just done a thing with 6 horses that not one man on the Tallow Mountains could have done, including him. I helped her with her bag. I couldn't help it. I liked her on sight. As we walked up toward the yard I said, "You'll forgive an old man, but folks generally come off that stage looking a little greener than you." She said her father had run freight down in the sweetgrass country, and she'd been raised on the box of a wagon before she could read. She said it plain, no boast in it, the way you'd say you were raised speaking a certain language. I asked what brought her this far north to marry a man she'd never seen. She was quiet a minute. Then she said, "My father died in the spring and the company sold his line, and they let me know there'd be no place on it for a woman, no matter whose daughter she was, no matter how well she drove." She said the word asterisk drove the way some folks say a prayer. She said, "A man named Rourke advertised for a wife who wasn't afraid of hard country. I wrote and asked him one question. I asked him did his line run freight over a real grade. He wrote back that it ran over the worst grade in the territory. So I came." I about stopped walking. I said, "Ma'am, you came 2,000 miles to marry a stranger on account of his mountain." She gave me a look that had a little smile buried in it, way down. She said, "I came on account of the marriage too, Mr. Pell. But a woman has to live somewhere, and I'd rather live somewhere with a grade." Gideon was in the yard mending a singletree when we came through the gate, and I'll never forget his face when he straightened up and saw her. He'd built a whole quiet picture in his head all summer. You could tell. Of some soft Eastern girl who'd hang curtains and fry his eggs and stay out of the part of him that hurt. And here came a slim, weather-browned woman in a traveling dress gone gray at the cuffs, with a teamster's hands and a way of looking at his wrecked spare wagon. There was one up on blocks against the fence that no Eastern girl ever had. Her eyes went straight to that wagon. She read the brake blocks like a doctor reading a man's face. I saw her see the worn shoe on the off-side block. the glazed place where somebody'd ridden the brake too hard and too long down a long drop. And I saw her understand something about this whole outfit before Gideon had said a word. He took his hat off, which was the most courtly thing I ever saw him do, and he said, "Miss Hartwell, I expect. Welcome to Coldwater Forks." And she said, "Mr. Rourke." And there was a silence in that yard you could have hung a coat on. He tried. I'll give him that. He showed her the house, which was a good square cabin with his dead brother's room shut up at the end of it, and he showed her the kitchen, and he said something about how he hoped she'd find it comfortable, and how the parson came through on the 1st of the month and they could be wed then if it suited her. And she said it suited her fine, in the same voice she'd used on the runaway, low and level. And then she turned around in the middle of his kitchen and she said, "Mr. Rourke, your spare wagon's got a brake rigged too short and your blocks are wearing crooked, and whoever's been driving your grade has been fighting the road the whole way down instead of letting the wagon find it. You're going to bury somebody." You could have heard the clock. Gideon's jaw went hard. I knew that jaw. I said a quick word to the Lord. He said very quiet, "The man who drove that wagon was my brother and the grade did bury him 2 winters back. And it'll not bury anyone else because no one drives that grade for this line without I say so." He looked at her hands then, deliberate, the calluses, the strength in them, and something crossed his face that wasn't kindness. He said, "You'll keep my house, Miss Hartwell. You'll not go near my box." I waited for her to cry, or to soften, or to do any of the things a woman fresh off a stage in a strange town 2,000 miles from anyone might do when the man she'd come to marry showed her the iron in him on the first afternoon. She did none of it. She looked at him a long moment, and I watched her file the whole thing away somewhere, careful, the way she'd ease a tired team into a stall. And she said, "All right, Mr. Rourke," and she set to making supper. She made it badly. I'll be honest with you. The biscuits could have shot a horse. She knew it too. She ate hers without a word and didn't apologize, and that was the first thing about her that made Gideon Rourke look at her twice, I think. That she could do a thing badly and not flinch from it, when she could do another thing better than any man alive and never once say so. That was the start of it. I want to tell it true, because in the months after, the whole town told it 100 ways, and most of them got it wrong. They made her into a marvel, or they made her into a scandal, and she was neither. She was just the best hand I ever saw, in a body the world had decided couldn't hold such a thing, married into the one outfit on the mountain that needed exactly what she had and was too torn up to take it. They were wed on the 1st, like he said. It was a plain wedding. The parson came through dusty, and a handful of us stood in the yard, and Gideon said his piece looking like a man signing a deed, and Della said hers looking out past all of us at the gap in the hills where the grade ran up into the timber. I stood close enough to hear the parson ask did she take this man, and I heard her say I do, and I believed her. Whatever she'd come for, she meant the vow. She just hadn't married a man who knew yet what he'd got. For her part, she kept the bargain to the letter. She kept his house. She learned the biscuits, slow, stubborn, until they came out fit to eat and then fit to brag on, though nobody bragged in that house. She mended and she cooked and she swept the dead brother's shut room once a week without ever being asked, and she never once went into the yard when the wagons were loading, never once put a hand to a line, because he'd told her not to and she'd said all right. But I'll tell you what she did do. She walked the grade. I found it out by accident. I'm an old man and I don't sleep much, and I was up at the yard past midnight one night in the early frost checking a mare in foal. And I saw a lantern bobbing way up the road where it climbs into the timber toward the Devil's Elbow, which is what we called the bad set of switchbacks halfway up, where the road folds back on itself 5 times over a drop that make your stomach quit. I thought it was somebody in trouble. I got a horse and went up, and partway I doused my own lantern and went quiet, the way you do, and I came around the second bend of the elbow and there she was, Della, walking the road. On foot in the dark, in her husband's old coat with the hem dragging. She had a lantern, but she had it set down in the ditch, not in her hand, and she was walking the outside edge of the curve slow, looking down at the road, and she'd stop and crouch and feel the surface with her bare hand, the ruts, the loose gravel, the place where the camber rolled the wrong way. Then she'd walk it again faster. Then faster. I sat my horse in the dark and watched her run a switchback she'd never driven, on her own 2 feet, learning where a loaded wagon would want to swing wide and where it'd want to cut, learning the road by heart the way a blind man learns his own house, so that when the time came and I understood, watching her, that in her mind the time was surely coming, she'd not be driving it for the first time. She'd be driving it for the 100th. I never told Gideon. I want that down. I never told him, and I've wondered since whether that was loyalty to her or cowardice about him, and I've decided it was both. I just watched her off and on, all through that hard, bright autumn. Some nights she'd take a length of rope and pace off a curve and tie knots in it, measuring. Some nights she'd just stand at the worst bend, the 4th one, the one we called the coffin because that's where Eli Rourke went over, and she'd stand there a long time looking at the drop with her hand on the rock, and I'd think she was grieving a man she never met, grieving him on behalf of the husband who couldn't. And then she'd shake it off and walk the road again, and her lips would move, counting. I asked her about it just once. I caught her coming down off the mountain at first gray light, mud to the knee, and I said, "Ms. Della, you're going to wear that road out with your feet." And she looked at me, not startled, like she'd known all along I'd seen, and she said, "Mr. Pell, a road has a shape. Most men drive against the shape and call it courage. My father taught me to find the shape and go with it." She said, "That grade up there isn't trying to kill anybody. It just has a shape, and nobody on this line has bothered to learn it." She nodded up at the timber. "Eli Rourke didn't die because the grade is wicked. He died because somebody let him drive it without knowing it." And she walked on past me to her husband's house to make his breakfast, and I stood there in the cold with my hat in my hand like I'd been to church. I'd best tell you now about the trouble the line was in, because everything that came after rode on it. Rourke Freight had one thing that kept it alive, and that was the contract to haul the payroll and the high-grade ore between the Coral Creek mines, way up at the top of the mountain, and the bank and the railhead down in the valley at Tallow Bend. Twice a month, a wagon went up emptyish with supplies and the miners' mail, and came down heavy with ore, and twice a month heavier still with the strongbox that paid every man at Coral Creek. Whoever held that contract held the mountain. And Gideon was about to lose it. He was about to lose it for 2 reasons. The first was that since Eli died, Gideon hadn't had a driver he trusted on the elbow with a full load, and a freight line that's afraid of its own grade gets slow, and slow loses contracts. Cleve Ott was game and strong, but he drove the way most men drove, fighting the road, riding the brake till it smoked. And twice that fall he'd had to lay over a night rather than take the coffin in bad light. And a payroll that's a day late is a payroll the mine manager remembers. The second reason was a man named Royce Tandy, who'd started up a rival line out of Tallow Bend with newer wagons and a banker's backing and a smile I never trusted, and who wanted that mine contract the way a coyote wants a henhouse. Tandy had been at the mine manager all autumn. Rourke's outfit is a one-man show held together with baling wire and a dead man's memory, he'd say. "You want a modern line. You want my line." It came to a head the week the first big snow was due. The mine manager, a fair-minded, worried man named Hollies, came down to the Forks himself and told Gideon to his face, "There's a double payroll going up the end of this week, on account of the holiday and the men's families, the biggest box of the year. It goes up Thursday, it comes down Saturday, and it has to be in the Tallow Bend bank before the bank closes Saturday evening or those men don't get paid before the snow shuts the pass, and a mountain full of unpaid miners before a long winter is a thing I won't have on my conscience." Hollies looked at the sky, which was the color of a gun. He said, "Tandy says he can guarantee it. Can you, Rourke? Because if you can't, the contract's his, and frankly the way your line's been crawling, I'm half of a mind already." I was standing right there. I watched Gideon Rourke's whole life come down to a yes or a no, and I watched him too proud and too scared both to say either one clean. He said he'd have it down on time. He said it flat. And Hollies looked at him a hard second and said, "You'd better," and rode off into the wind. That was Tuesday. Wednesday it started to snow up high, just a skift, just enough to glaze the road. Wednesday night Cleve Ott took the empty supply wagon up to make the run early and get ahead of the weather, and Thursday noon he didn't come down, and Thursday near dark a mine boy came tearing down on a mule to say there had been a wreck on the elbow. The supply wagon was on its side at the coffin with a wheel gone over. The team cut loose and saved, and Cleve under it with his leg broke in 2 places. We got him down. He was alive and he'd mend, but he was done driving for the season, done for that winter shore. And there we were, Thursday night, with the biggest payroll of the year sitting up at Coral Creek waiting to come down a snow-glazed grade by Saturday evening, and the one man on the line who could halfway drive the elbow lying in my back room with a splinted leg, and the snow coming on, and Royce Tandy in town buying drinks and waiting like a buzzard for the news. Gideon sat at his own table that night with his head in his hands. I'd come to sit with him because I didn't know what else to do, and Della was there, and the lamp was low. He said to no one, "I'll have to take it down myself." And I knew, and Della knew, that he couldn't. Gideon Rourke hadn't driven the elbow loaded since the day they brought his brother down it wrapped in a tarp. He could ride it, he could walk it, he could grease every wagon that went over it, but he could not sit the box of a loaded freight wagon at the coffin and ride it through, and he knew it, and the knowing was eating him alive. He'd freeze at the 4th bend. A man who freezes at the coffin with a full load behind him is a dead man, and worse, he kills his team. He couldn't do it, and there was no one else. Della had been mending by the fire, quiet as always, and she set the mending down in her lap. She didn't stand up. She didn't raise her voice. She said, "Gideon, let me take it down." I have never in my life heard a room go as still as that one. Even the fire seemed to hush. He lifted his head out of his hands and he looked at her like she'd struck him. He said, "No, just that, no." And she said, "Lo, I have driven 1,000 miles of grade. I have walked your elbow 40 nights in the dark. I know every foot of that road better than any man who ever sat your box, better than Cleve, better," and she stopped, because she'd been about to say better than your brother, and she had the mercy not to. She said instead, "I know your road, Gideon. I have learned it the way my father taught me, with my hands and my feet in the dark, so I'd never have to learn it the first time with a load behind me. Let me take it down." And Gideon Rourke stood up so fast his chair went over and the iron came up in him, the same iron from her first afternoon, and he said, "And I'll not soften it because it's part of the story and he paid for it later," he said. "I will lose the contract and the line and the house before I'll watch this mountain do to my wife what it did to my brother. You'll not go near that box. You'll keep my house. That was the bargain." And Della stood up too, and she was a head shorter than him, and she did not back up 1 inch. She said, "That was your bargain. I never asked for it. You posted for a wife who wasn't afraid of hard country. And I am the least afraid person you will ever meet, and you have spent 10 weeks pretending you married a woman who can't do the one thing she does better than breathing, because you can't bear to be saved by the same road that took your brother." She said it gently, even, which made it worse. She said, "I am sorry about Eli, Gideon. I have grieved him on that mountain more nights than you know. But I did not come 2,000 miles to fry your eggs and watch your line die for your pride." He went out into the snow. He didn't put on his coat. I heard him out at the corral half the night, doing nothing, just standing in the snow with the horses, and Della sat by the fire with the mending in her lap not mending, and I went home because there are some nights a man's got no business in. Friday it snowed all day. By Friday night there was 4 inches in the forks, and the Lord only knew how much up top, and the pass would close behind the first hard storm, and that storm was Sunday by the look of the sky. So the payroll had to come down Saturday, or it didn't come down at all, and the men of Coral Creek would winter unpaid, and Rourke freight would be finished. And Della Rourke's husband sat in his cold yard and could not save any of it and could not bring himself to let the one person who could. I'll tell you when it turned. It turned Saturday before dawn. I was up, old men, I told you, and I came over to the yard to look at the weather, and there was a lantern in the barn. I went in soft. Della was there, in a man's wool trousers and Eli Rourke's old driving coat that she'd taken down off the peg in the shut room, and she was harnessing the freight team in the dark, the big steady six that Eli used to drive, working fast and quiet and sure, and her hands knew every buckle. She'd loaded nothing yet. The box was up at the mine, but she meant to take the empty wagon up, load it, and bring the payroll down, and she meant to do it whether Gideon waked or not, because somebody had to and she was somebody. I should have run for him. I want to be honest with you about all of it, even the part where I'm no hero. I didn't run for him. I went and got the lead horse's bridles and I helped her. God forgive me or thank me. I don't know which, but at my age you've watched enough good things die of other men's fear that when you finally see somebody fixing to do the brave, necessary thing, you tend to hand them the bridle. But Gideon waked. He must have felt the bed cold beside him or heard the harness chains. He came across the yard in the gray dark in his shirt sleeves and stood in the barn door, and Della turned with a trace chain in her hands and faced him, and I stepped back against the wall because this was between them. And here's the thing I came all this way in the telling to say. He didn't shout. The iron was gone out of him. He'd spent it all in the snow. He stood there looking at his wife in his dead brother's coat with his dead brother's team in hand, ready to go down the road that killed Eli, to save everything Gideon had and couldn't save himself, and the man just broke open. Quiet, like ice going off a roof in the sun. He said, if I let you go up there and that mountain takes you too, I will not survive it. I did not survive Eli. I have been a dead man working a dead man's line for 2 years. He said, I posted for a wife so the house wouldn't be so quiet, and you came, and you are the most alive thing I have ever stood next to, and I have spent 10 weeks afraid to look straight at you because I knew he stopped and got it out. I knew if I looked, I'd love you, and I cannot lose another person to that road. And Della Hartwell set down the trace chain and she crossed that barn, and she took her husband's face in those teamsters' hands, gentle as she gentled the runaway, and she said, then look at me. And he did. And she said, I am not Eli. I am not going to drive against that road and lose. I am going to drive with asterisk it, the way my father taught me, the way I have practiced on your mountain 40 nights while you slept, and I am going to bring your payroll down and walk back into this house on my own 2 feet and make you the worst biscuits in the territory for the rest of your life. She said, you didn't marry a woman the grade can take, Gideon. You married the one woman on this mountain it can't. He held on to her a minute. Then he stepped back and he wiped his face with the heel of his hand, and he did the bravest thing I ever saw him do, braver than driving any grade, which was to hand her the long whip off its peg and say, the coffin's worst about 1/3 of the way through the turn, the camber rolls outward, it'll want to throw you. And she took the whip and she said, I know. I've felt it with my hand in the dark. I go in high and let the wagon come down through it, I don't fight it. And he stared at her because that was exactly right. That was the thing he and Cleve and even Eli had never quite trusted themselves to do, and he understood all at once that his wife knew his mountain better than any living man. He said, then I'll ride up with you and bring the team back. Let me at least do that. And she said, yes. Come. So they went up in the dawn, the 2 of them on the empty wagon, and I stood in the yard and watched the lantern climb into the white timber, and I prayed. And then I did the only useful thing left to an old man, which was to go down to the Tallow Bend Road and watch for them to come, and to take a position outside the saloon where Royce Tandy was sure to be, because I wanted to see his face. The town knew by then. Word travels in a snow like a fire in dry grass. By Saturday afternoon, there were folks all up and down the Tallow Bend Road, by the church, by the bank, waiting in the cold, because the whole valley had heard that Rourke's broke-leg driver was down, and the contract was lost and the miners wouldn't get paid. And then the second word came, the unbelievable word, that Rourke's wife, the strange woman off the spring stage, had gone up the mountain to bring the payroll down the devil's elbow herself. Half the town didn't believe it. Half the half that believed it laughed. Royce Tandy laughed loudest of all, out on the saloon porch with a cigar, telling anyone who'd listened that Rourke had finally lost his mind altogether, sending a woman to do a man's dying for him, and that he, Tandy, would have the contract signed by Monday, and the only question was whether they'd bury the woman before or after. I stood near him and I held my tongue, which has never come easy to me, because I'd learned a thing watching Della on that road in the dark, and the thing was this. There's no point arguing with a man about what a person can do. You let the person do it, and then there's nothing left to argue. The light started to go. It does early in the snow up against those mountains. And the snow started again, soft at first, then steady. The front edge of Sunday's storm coming early like everyone feared, and a groan went up and down that waiting road, because a snow on the elbow at dusk with a loaded wagon was the worst thing there was, and even the ones who'd come to cheer started to come to dread. And then somebody up the road cried out and pointed. She came down out of the timber into the last of the light with the snow on her, and I knew her by the way the wagon moved before I could make out her face. I'd seen good drivers all my life, and they all had a sound and a look, a kind of effort, the team straining one way and the man hauling another, the brake screaming, the whole rig fighting itself down the mountain. This was nothing like that. The loaded wagon came down out of the white timber and through the worst of the lower bends like water finding its level, smooth, unhurried. The team gathered and easy, the wagon swinging through each curve like it was glad to. And on the box sat a small figure in a dead man's coat with the lines in her two hands and her body moving with the road, leaning into it, going with its shape, never against, riding the brake in little touches like a heartbeat, and then easing off. Letting the grade do the grade's work and only guiding it, the way you'd guide a thing you loved and trusted rather than a thing you feared. I've seen a great many wagons come down that grade in 30 years. I never saw one come down like a thing that belonged to the mountain. That one did, and dead silent on the box, while a town that had laughed at her stood frozen in the falling snow. Della Rourke brought the biggest payroll the Coral Creek mines ever cut down the Devil's Elbow and across the flat and up the snow-packed street and stopped the team, soft as a held breath, square in front of the Tallow Bend bank, 8 minutes before it closed. Nobody made a sound for a second. Then Hollies, the mine manager who'd come down himself to wait, walked out into the snow bareheaded and put his hand on the wheel and looked up at her on the box, and I saw his throat work, and he said, loud enough for the whole street, in 20 years on this mountain that's the finest piece of driving I have ever witnessed, and I'd not have believed it possible. And he turned around to the crowd and he said, the contract stays with Rourke. It stays with Rourke as long as that woman wants to drive my road. And the street came apart. Folks who'd laughed an hour before were hollering her name. The miners' families who'd thought they'd winter unpaid were weeping right out in the road. And Della Rourke sat up on the box one more second, in the snow, in Eli's coat, and she didn't grin and she didn't bow. She just looked down the road the way she'd come, up at the mountain in the dark, like she was thanking it. Then she found me in the crowd, me, the old man who'd handed her the bridle, and she gave me one small nod, and I have kept that nod for the rest of my life. I'll tell you about Royce Tandy since I promised. He didn't say a word. He let his cigar go out, and about a week later he sold his shiny wagons and went on south, and good riddance, and the mountain was glad of it. But that's not the end I want to leave you with. The end I want to leave you with came later, after they'd unloaded the box into the bank, and Gideon had come down off the mountain bringing the wagon cleave wrecked, after the town had finally given them peace. I was up at the yard that night, banking the forge. Gideon and Della came in to put the team away together, the both of them, working the harness off in the lantern light, not saying much, the easy quiet of two people who'd been through a thing. And when the horses were rubbed down and fed, Gideon Rourke stood there in the barn turning his hat in his hands the way he had the first afternoon, and I started to make myself scarce, the way an old man learns to, but he said, no, Gus, stay. I want a witness for this, and so I stayed. He said, Della, and she waited, and he said, I married you for the wrong reason. I married you to keep a house quiet so I wouldn't have to feel how empty it was. He said, that's a poor thing to have done to a person and I'm sorry for it. And she started to speak and he held up a hand, gentle, and went on. He said, I don't want a housekeeper. I never did. I just couldn't admit what I wanted, which was to be alive again. And you are the most alive thing on this mountain. And I have been a fool and a coward for 10 weeks about it. He said, the line's half yours from this day. I'll have it painted on the wagons, Rourke and Hartwell, your father's name beside mine. Because no Rourke ever drove that grade the way you did, and the wagons ought to say so. He said, you drive whatever you want to drive for the rest of your life, and I'll hold the lead horses and be proud to. And then his voice went down low. He said, but I'm asking you for something I've no right to ask, having married you the way I did. I'm asking you to stay because you want to, and not because you came 2,000 miles and there's nowhere to go. He said, if you want to go, the line's still half yours and I'll put you on the next stage with my blessing. But if you'd stay, he stopped. And he was no kind of speech maker, Gideon, and the words came out plain and shook a little. If you'd stay, and let me love you the right way round this time, I'd be the luckiest man this side of the divide. And Della Hartwell stood in the lantern light with axle grease on her hands and her dead father's whole gift alive in her, and she didn't answer him right off. She let him stand there in it, because she was a woman who made you mean a thing before she gave you the answer. Then she walked over and took his face in her hands the way she had that morning, the way she had with the runaway, gentle and certain, and she said, Gideon Rourke, I have driven 1,000 miles of road looking for the place I was supposed to stop. And she put her forehead against his and she said, I stopped here. I stopped the first afternoon when you showed me your wrecked wagon, and I knew this whole outfit needed exactly the one thing the world had told me I wasn't allowed to be. She said, I'll stay. Not because there's nowhere to go. Because there's nowhere I'd rather be than the box of your worst wagon, on the worst grade in the territory, with you on the lead horses being proud of me. And then she said, but the biscuits are going to stay bad, and I want that understood going in. And he laughed, Gideon Rourke laughed, a sound I hadn't heard out of the man in 2 years, and he kissed her there in the barn, and I took myself off into the snow and left them to it. And I banked the forge in the dark with my eyes stinging, telling myself it was the smoke. They painted the wagons that spring, Rourke and Hartwell, in good red letters on every box. She drove the elbow twice a month for 11 years and never once let it take her, because she never once fought it. She went with its shape, the way her father taught her, the way she taught the young men who came on after, none of whom ever drove it half so well and all of whom knew it. The town that laughed got old telling their grandchildren they'd been there the snowy Saturday the rancher's wife brought the payroll down. And Gideon Rourke came back to life beside her, slow, the way a hard country comes green again after a long winter, and that shut room at the end of the cabin got opened and aired and turned in time into a nursery. But that's another story and a good one. I'm an old man and I've told this badly, the way I do everything but shoe a horse. But I wanted it set down right, on account of how the world looked at that woman the day she stepped off the stage and decided what she could and couldn't be, and how the world was wrong. She wasn't a marvel and she wasn't a scandal. She was a master, the way some folks just are, and the only thing rare about her was that the world had spent her whole life telling her the thing she was best at on this earth wasn't allowed to her. And she'd had the quiet iron to learn it anyway, in the dark, on her own 2 feet, for the day somebody would finally hand her the bridle. Gideon Rourke handed her the bridle. It's the best thing the man ever did, and he knew it. And if you'd asked him in his old age what he was proudest of in a long, hard life on that mountain, he'd not have said the line, nor the contract, nor the wagons with both names on them. He'd have said the morning he stopped being afraid long enough to look straight at his wife and let her be exactly what she was. He told me so himself, near the end, sitting on the porch watching her come down off the grade in the evening light, gray-headed by then and still the finest hand on the mountain, the team easy under her hands and the wagon swinging through the last bend like it was glad to. She always did make it look like the road was glad to carry her. I've thought about that a great deal in the years since they've both been gone. I think maybe it was.